1600, a group of London merchants sent a letter to Queen Elizabeth I asking for permission to trade with Asia. She said yes. She gave them a royal charter, a monopoly on Eastern trade, and a name. They called themselves the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies. Most people today call them the East India Company. What most people don't know is that by the time it was over, that company would govern 200 million people, command the largest private army in the history of the world, trigger famines that killed tens of millions, and when it finally collapsed, make the people it had spent a century looting pay off its debts. This is the story of the most powerful corporation that has ever existed, and it ends with one of the greatest financial frauds ever committed. But before we get to the collapse, and you're going to want to stay for that because the way this ends is unlike anything I've found in any other story, we need to understand what the East India Company actually was. Because what they taught you in school, if they taught you anything at all, leaves out almost everything that matters. Most people understand the EIC as a trading company: ships, spices, tea. That framing is accurate for maybe the first 50 years. After that, it becomes something that has no real modern equivalent. Think of it this way. Imagine if Amazon had its own standing army, its own court system, its own prisons, its own tax collectors, its own currency. And imagine that Amazon used all of those things not to compete in a market, but to become the government of an entire subcontinent. That is what the East India Company did. And it did it gradually enough that by the time anyone in Britain was paying close attention, it had already happened. The turning point was 1757. At the Battle of Plassey, EIC forces under Robert Clive defeated the Nawab of Bengal through a combination of military force and a prearranged betrayal by the Nawab's own general, who had been bribed. The battle lasted about 11 hours. What followed lasted nearly 200 years. Within 8 years of that battle, the company had been granted the Diwani, the right to collect taxes directly from the province of Bengal. This was not a trading right. This was the power of a sovereign government, handed to a private company whose ultimate obligation was to its shareholders in London. And here is the detail that changes how you see everything that came after. The EIC didn't use Bengal's tax revenue to invest in Bengal. It used Bengal's tax revenue to buy Bengal's goods, silk, cotton, spices, and then exported and sold those goods at enormous profit back in European markets. The money never left. India was funding its own extraction. Economist Utsa Patnaik spent decades tracing the ledgers, and her research, published through Columbia University Press, estimates that Britain drained the equivalent of $45 trillion from India between 1765 and 1938. 45 trillion! The number is almost too large to hold in your mind, which is perhaps why it rarely appears in the history books that describe this period as the era of free trade. But the scale of the extraction is not even the most important thing to understand about the company. The most important thing is what happened when extraction met famine. In 1769, monsoon rains failed across Bengal. Crops died, and the East India Company, which was now the functioning government of the province, faced a choice. It could reduce the tax burden on farmers who had just lost everything, or it could maintain collection rates and keep exporting grain to protect its profit margins. It chose the second option. By 1770, somewhere between 7 and 10 million people were dead. 1/3 of Bengal's entire population gone in roughly 18 months. The company's own correspondence from the period shows administrators acknowledging the scale of the dying. They kept collecting anyway. When news eventually reached London, Parliament launched an inquiry. The inquiry concluded the company had mismanaged the situation. No criminal charges, no suspension of the charter. The company continued operating. Now, here is where I need to acknowledge the counterargument, because this story is complicated enough that it deserves honesty. There were people inside the company who understood that what was happening was wrong. Edmund Burke spent years in Parliament trying to prosecute Warren Hastings, the Governor-General of Bengal, for crimes committed in the company's name. The trial lasted 7 years. Hastings was ultimately acquitted, and some of the infrastructure the company built, railways, telegraph lines, legal codification, did persist and did create lasting institutions. The defenders of this history are not making things up. Those things exist. What they leave out is the calendar. Specifically, what the company was doing in the same decades it was building those railways. By the 1840s, the EIC was in serious financial trouble. Not because trade had slowed. Bengal's wealth was still flowing into London, but because the company had expanded faster than its revenues could support. It had borrowed enormous sums to fund military campaigns across the subcontinent. It was paying dividends to shareholders that it could not actually afford. And it was running an administrative apparatus of staggering complexity, entirely on debt. In 1772, it came so close to collapse that it sent a letter to the British government requesting a bailout of £1.4 million. Parliament obliged. It was one of the first government bailouts of a private corporation in modern history, and it came with almost no structural reform. The company continued paying its shareholders. The debt stayed on the government's books. This is the part that should stop you cold. Because in 1772, the company was already broke, and yet it would continue operating for another 86 years. It would expand deeper into India. It would trigger more famines. It would fight more wars. All of it financed by a combination of tax extraction from Indian subjects and emergency credit from the British state. The shareholders kept collecting. The risk kept being transferred outward, first to the British taxpayer, and eventually to the people of India themselves. The end came in 1857. What the British called the Indian Mutiny, and what Indian historians call the First War of Independence, was a widespread uprising against company rule. It began with Indian soldiers in the company's own army and spread across the north of the country. The company's private military, the same force that had conquered the subcontinent, found itself unable to suppress it without direct intervention from the British Crown. Parliament stepped in. In 1858, the East India Company was formally dissolved. Queen Victoria assumed direct sovereignty over India. And the company's outstanding debt, roughly £100 million, was transferred to the government of India. Read that again. The East India Company spent nearly a century extracting wealth from India. When it finally collapsed, India was handed the bill. The people who had been governed without consent, taxed without representation, and subjected to policies that contributed to mass death, were now legally obligated to repay the creditors of the corporation that had done those things to them. The debt was serviced through continued taxation of Indian subjects. It took decades to pay off. The company disappeared. The mechanism stayed. Every administrator the company had trained, every tax system it had built, every legal framework it had installed was absorbed directly into the British Raj. The logo changed. The structure didn't. India wouldn't gain independence until 1947, 89 years after the company's dissolution. The machine it had built outlasted it by nearly a century. There is a historian named Nick Robbins who wrote what is probably the most thorough modern account of the EIC's financial history. He called it simply the corporation that changed the world. He noted that the company's story anticipates almost every major debate we still have today about corporate power, about what happens when private profit and public governance become the same thing, about who bears the cost when that arrangement fails, about whether shareholders should be protected while the populations they extracted from are left to absorb the damage. The East India Company went bankrupt and made someone else pay. That someone was the country it had spent 200 years taking from. And the men who had profited most from those 200 years retired with their fortunes intact, having never been held accountable for a single famine, a single forced extraction, a single vote they denied to 200 million people who lived under their authority without ever being asked. There is a building in London on Leadenhall Street where the company's headquarters once stood. It was torn down in 1861, 3 years after dissolution. An insurance company built its offices on the site. Later, a bank. The records were archived. Most of the men involved died wealthy. And for a very long time, the story that emerged from those archives was a story about trade and ships and the spread of civilization. The ledgers tell a different story. $45 trillion extracted, tens of millions dead in preventable famines, a bankruptcy paid off by the people who had been robbed, and a government that absorbed the entire operation, renamed it an empire, and kept it running for another 90 years. The most powerful corporation in history didn't fall because it was stopped. It fell because it ran out of road. And when it did, it handed the wreckage to the people standing underneath it, called the transfer a legal settlement, and walked away. If that sounds familiar, it's because the template it established has never really gone away. We just stopped putting a company name on it.